You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Glad to be back. I see the learning curve with the Revolutionary Matron is in the house. Peace to the Revolutionary Matron. She had a great show on earlier this evening, ended about 40 minutes ago. Great show. I was in attendance quietly. You guys should be in attendance whenever she goes live. Make sure to support her, Pro-Black Perspective, and the Hashiali Podcast as we grow this podcast network to be even bigger. Just a reminder that this show is, in fact, a part of a podcast network. There are other shows that you are invited to listen to on the podcast network called KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron, on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure to tune in to all of those shows. Peace to Dorico Cooper Photography. Peace to KW Dawn 7. These are the diehard listeners for the show. I appreciate you guys. That includes the Revolutionary Matron. So much love to all of you who consistently come through, consistently check out and participate in what's going on here at the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I do appreciate you. If you're not on the Discord, we have a Discord server. The link is in the description as well as at the top of the chat. Join the Discord. I know most of you who said greetings are on the Discord already, but if you're new here today, join the Discord and get involved in the activities that we have going on there. So this paper was a paper I was going to ignore. I was going to ignore it because I'm aware of what it's talking about, but I don't know, and I changed my mind because I was like, maybe not everyone is aware of some of these things. It's an older paper. I like reading older papers anyway, because that's where I jump off from to when I do my research on more recent papers. This paper is from 1940. But there's some things I read in it earlier that was true 55, 60 years later when I was a freshman in college, right, during my undergraduate career. And I want to share some of those thoughts with you. This paper is called Some Theories Regarding the Education of the Negro, right, or African People by William H. Jones. So I want you guys to listen, and you guys let me know, if you're live with me especially, but if you're listening to the playback, you can do the same. You guys let me know if some of this stuff sounds really familiar to you. Right? In fact, let me do this as well before I begin. I tend to forget. I tend to forget to stream on the Discord that I'm telling you guys you can join. I'm streaming on the Discord live as well. All right, let's get to the reading. A most powerful conception which has long dominated the thinking of the American Negro is his belief that education is his certain way of salvation. Now I gotta pause there already. How many of you grew up in families, you don't have to be an American African, but how many of you grew up in families where they push the idea that education is your passport to a better life, to freedom, as they say in this paper, to some form of salvation, right? A most powerful conception which has long dominated the thinking of the American Negro is his belief that education is his certain way of salvation. Let me just say this too. This is true in the Caribbean. This is true in the continent, right? Ever since his emancipation from slavery, education has been regarded by him as a sort of magical cloak for covering up his inferiority in American society. He has conceived of it as the one sure thing which can enable him to measure arms with his superiors. This hunger for formal education was greatly stimulated and intensified by the tendency on the part of Southern white people to discourage and frustrate these desires. Accordingly, it was only human that the Negro should have hungered for what was so generally denied him, right? And this concept, right, this thesis, if you will, right here, right, that black folks, black equals African folks, being human, right, will hunger for what's generally denied to them. Now, there's a couple of places I could go with this, you know, Frantz Fanon, Kwame Nkrumah. You get the idea, right? Jope, right? For hungering for what was generally denied to him. But this little thesis here is going to be important in the reading of this paper. Because the reality of it is, as the colonized, if you have been following along the conversation on the Wretched of the Earth, the deep reading by the pro-black perspective, if you follow along, you'll realize that it's not at all wrong in this day and age to consider yourself colonized versus colonizer, right? And when you're in that condition, right, a lot of our folk, a lot of our mindset would be to hunger for what is being generally denied to us under these conditions of colonized and colonizer. So keep that in mind. The Negro has always craved to come into possession of those things which the white man has, things which seem to account for white superiority. The Negro feels that the supremacy of the white man consists in the things which are associated with him. As you guys know, I'm not a big fan of the term white supremacy. I'm also less of a big fan of white nationalism because I find that white nationalism is a little too sterile for me. I've said this recently. The idea is that these folks are wicked, that these folks are looking out for their own, which is fine, but the harming of others at will, willy-nilly, no justice, all that kind of shit, you know, there's a deviousness to that, right? A lot of us, though, think that success has to be done their way, that freedom has to come about their way, or at least how it appears on the outside looking into that bullshit that they got going on. And this paper was written in 1940. A lot of us are still today thinking in this way. In other words, he has been led to regard the things which the white man produces as being the causes of his greatness, rather than the results of his genius and industry. Accordingly, he has enthusiastically and uncritically taken over, one after another, the various phases of the white man's culture. Now, a lot of people don't want to hear that. A lot of people won't want to hear that. Right? KW Dawn 7 prefers the white hegemonic system. Right? And that's fine too. I don't know if the white hegemonic system denotes the sheer evil that these folks are. Right? He has been led to regard the things which the white man produces as being the causes of his greatness. A lot of black folks look at what white folks do and think that that's the reason why they're great, rather than the results of his genius and industry. Now, of course, that genius and industry stuff is questionable shit too. But I want you to follow along with that basic idea that I put forth a second ago. Accordingly, he has enthusiastically and uncritically taken over, one after another, the various phases of the white man's culture, the white man's mannerisms, his education, his religion, his modes of dressing, his extravagant modes of living, and in fact, nearly all of his vices and his virtues have been appropriated by the Negro. But y'all ain't hearing me though. You've taken on the way this white boy acts, whatever God this white boy claims to believe in. You're dressing like him, and you're trying to keep up with the white Joneses while you're at it too. Jericho Kubu Vittori says, call a spade a spade. Absolutely. Black folks back in the day doing heroin and all that shit. Who you got that from? You know, when I was reading this paper, I was thinking about Malcolm X the whole way through in that speech. Who taught you to hate yourself? You know? And this is going to culminate in a very important point I want to make. One I've made in various ways before on the show, but I had a conversation earlier today that really makes me have to make this point tonight. But let's continue the paper for now. This zeal for education, therefore, is just another example of the Negro's attempt to bring all phases of his life into conformity with the accepted norms of American society. Almost from the very beginning of the program to educate the Negro, there has been the most pronounced disagreement as to the kind of education which he should receive. This question has given rise to at least two distinct theories of equipping the American Negro with a technique for social adjustment. One of these theories advocates the training of Negroes along technical lines. That is, it places emphasis on the necessity of acquiring skill in the ordinary pursuits of gaining a livelihood. One must work well with his hands. The most prominent advocate of this doctrine was the late Booker T. Washington. The other theory, of which Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois is, or was, the chief protagonist, repudiates this doctrine and conceives of the educational needs of the Negro in terms of his higher spiritual and intellectual possibilities. The weakness of the positions of these two theories lies in the fact that instead of supplementing each other, they have apparently been antagonistic and therefore detrimental to the best educational interests of the American Negro. And that's something, when I did my research into Booker T and Tuskegee, right? When I did my research, this point here stood out to me, right? We shouldn't direct, and now I'm speaking for us now, we shouldn't direct our children in one or the other. Is one and or the other, because when we're talking about nation building, we're going to need all of it. Maybe not necessarily in the building of the nation part, in the nation building aspect, but when you have the nation, you're going to need all of it. And you can't wait until you have the nation to start getting it. KW7 says, I would still call individuals like Jared Taylor or Richard Spencer white. Yeah, sure, you could call individuals like Jared Taylor or Richard Spencer white nationalists, right? Because they're just tooting their own horns, right? But the people who are imposing white nationalism using violence, etc., intimidation and violence, and miseducation and corruption and all that stuff, right? I personally prefer to call those supremacists, right? One cannot deny the importance of vocational training for Negroes. Neither can one minimize the value of the special emphasis which has been and is still being placed upon it for the economic status of the Negro in America, is such as to require a system of training that will enable him, first of all, to earn his bread and butter, that will render him capable of creating for himself an economic world in which he may more easily find expression for his higher intellectual and spiritual powers. But even the Negro's economic improvement is determined by an intellectual and spiritual enlargement, which only higher education can make possible. For higher education awakens all of the elements of his being and enables him better to see his limitations and possibilities, better to think out genuine schemes for finding his way out of difficulties, and better to avoid the pitfalls of the future. I used to tell people this all the time, and this is not a knock against working with your hands, right? This is a thought I used to have. So when I was back in my hometown, I used to work for the brewery. And the job I did really was, when people brought bottles, empty bottles in, I sorted the case, right? Made sure there was none broken in the case. And then me and the other guys, we stacked them. There was a particular way you stack beer cases, empty bottles on a pallet. And then we had to go then take the pallet and stock up the trailer, right? So it could go to the main brewery to be recycled and used again for new beer, etc. And one of the things I noticed, and this was right out of high school, I think. Yeah, this was right out of high school. One of the things I noticed was that when you're working with your hands, there comes a point where it's mindless. You're just doing repetitious work. It's just muscle memory at a point. You're not thinking about anything. But if you go after some higher education, so to speak, some tertiary level education, it'll put your mind in different positions to think about different things, problems and other things, right? You can still go back and work with your hands, But if you could open up a person's mind who also works with his hands, that's ideal. Right? Mr. Untouchable says, but Koku, how should black people act when their knowledge of selves has been completely stripped away from them? There was a void that was created within him, and it's replaced with another mind. Pro-Black Perspective says, we in here, peace to the Pro-Black Perspective. Dorico Cooper says, call them MAGAs or Red Hats. So, Mr. Untouchable, you've kind of unlocked a conversation I had that I said I was going to talk about sometime later in the show, but here's my thing. Here's my thing. I'm trying not to be flustered when I say this. Conversation I had earlier is that I was saying, and I've said it on the show before, and I stand by it, that there is some self-accountability. Hold on a second. There's some self-accountability that black folks need to have. And we didn't just come out of being in, chattel slavery. We didn't just come out of that yesterday. We didn't just come out of Jim Crow yesterday. The civil rights movement and all the greats who were a part of it, that didn't just happen yesterday. We've had Garvey 100 years ago. We've had Malcolm X and MLK, and I know people have their issues with those folks, that's fine, whatever. We've had those people have been gone 60 years. We've had Kwame Ture and a host of others. In fact, frig that, we've had the Haitian Revolution and the founders and the architects of Haiti. And what I was saying in my discussion earlier is simply this. We cannot keep claiming ignorance. There's been a push of consciousness in black society for too long now. And it didn't just start upon the so-called Emancipation Proclamation. We had people, while in bondage, putting that knowledge out there, putting that thought process out there. There's a thing in law. If you commit a crime, you can't go into court and tell the man, well, boy, I didn't know that was a crime. But sir, you ran over 4 people. Well, I didn't know, but I didn't know nothing about. Like, you can't go and do that. You can get donkey years in jail for that type of stuff. We gotta start being accountable. And I know it's nuanced. I know that there's indoctrination. I know that there's abuses and stuff that have been carried out over a long period of time. But how long are we going to continue talking about the abuses, the indoctrination, and not take accountability for the shit that we're doing to one another in our communities? A part of the conversation I had today, and I've talked about this on the show before, is this idea that, I watch this guy Vlad TV, right? And Vlad had on this guy Melvin Farmer, who created one of the Crip sets. I've talked about this before, so bear with me as I rehash this story. And Melvin Farmer, he's an older man now. He regrets even starting that bullshit, right? And why does he regret it? Because he realized it was anti-black. And something interesting he said, we knew it was anti-black when we did this shit. One of the stories he tells, which is so like where I come from, you call this fella a sissy if a fella come around you talking this type of talk. This fella said, well, I'm going to use a street that a street that I come from. This guy said, well, we didn't go past Market Street to commit no crimes, because we know when you cross over Market Street, right, on the other side of East Street, if you cross over Market Street, we know that down there is them white folks, you can get 25 years to life for committing crime. So we stayed on this side where black folks was. Don't tell me you don't know that shit. Don't tell me you don't know that's some bullshit. Don't tell me you don't know that. So there's a, and again, I know it's nuanced, right? Again, going back to Mr. Untouchable, how should black people act when their knowledge of selves has been completely stripped away? That question, respectfully, would have been a real heavy question to answer back in 1865. Maybe even 1965. But we gotta stop. We have to put down the excuses now. It's time. Put down the excuses now. I'm not saying that it's simple, that it's an easy one, but I'm saying that claiming ignorance of self at this point, with all these people we had come before us, all this wealth of knowledge out here, we gotta give that up. All right? I continue. Where was I? For higher education awakens all the elements of his being and enables him better to see his limitations and possibilities, better to think out genuine schemes for finding his way out of difficulties, and better to avoid the pitfalls of the future. Unquestionably, some of the obstacles which have loomed largest in the pathway of the Negro's progress have been his inadequate knowledge of human history and his failure to appreciate the laws of social evolution and the essential characteristics of human nature. He does not adequately understand man and society. Accordingly, he has been guilty of oversimplifying his problem. So this is interesting. He has not accounted for all the factors involved. It is therefore obvious that the Negro is in need of all types of education that will enable him to come into fuller self-realization. The principal indictment against higher education for Negroes has been that it has generally increased their wishes and wants without proportionally increasing their economic resourcefulness, their initiative, and their efficiency. So there's something in here that I can tell you. There's something in here I can tell you that resonated with me. I'll point it out in a second. The principal indictment against higher education for Negroes has been that it has greatly increased their wishes and wants without proportionally increasing their economic resourcefulness, their initiative, and their efficiency. In this connection, reference is generally made to the large number of educated Negroes who either will not work or cannot find work, for those who prey upon the superstitious, those who prey upon the superstitions, failures, and weaknesses of the masses, of those who form the vanguard of the antisocial element within the race, and those who, because of their morbid pessimism, either repudiate their race or subtly endeavor to escape from it by increasing their wants without giving them adequate avenues. So this is the thing. When we talk about education, one of the things, and I mentioned this maybe a year ago, but when we talk about creating a better education for our people, better curriculum, right? The important thing that we need to address simultaneously, if not beforehand, is we have to have the areas for these educated Africans right? These properly educated Africans. We have to have the areas for them to go into and do the work. If we're talking about nation building, then the areas will be there for them to go and work. But if you're trying to rethread the old bullshit of being in America and getting educated to fit in, that's a fool's errand. That's a waste of time. It's a waste of time. Because you're just going to go through all these years of getting education to go beg this white boy for a job. And then have to go on this job and walk on thin ice if you're not careful. Every day that you go in there. We're educating to build. And in that sense, we need all knowledge areas. We're educating to build. But if you still have this pipe dream of you're educating to go and, you know, get a nice job somewhere, that's a waste of time. So the problem that we had historically is that we went and we got this education, we felt better about ourselves for a minute while we were in our neighborhoods. But then we had to go dress up like the white boy and then go in his neighborhood to go ask for a job. Please, sir, can I have more gruel? So the action step, the action plan that we need to have is to get education, to get the education that we need in the service of the nation that we need to build. By increasing their wants without giving them adequate avenues for expression, and by intensifying their restlessness, higher education has doubtless done much to render a large number of educated Negroes mere intellectual vagabonds, misfits. But it should also be noted that few of these intellectual vagabonds are genuinely educated persons. Many of them have merely passed through school, persons who were exposed to the contagion of education, but who had only a mild attack of the disease. This goes back to, you know, Carter G. Woodson and miseducation. Yeah, you went to school, but you learned about Romans and Greeks and all this old stuff, so you just, you know, someone coughed on you, but you didn't get really sick. And so this is the need for the African-centered education. Tatum says, what's up, Tatums? Mr. Untouchable says, but equally, we have had white Jesus for 400 years. We have had the Queen for many years, and we're still being taught Columbus discovered the Americas. Ask most black people, most black high school graduate who Garvey is. So again, there's a saying, it's actually a biblical thing, but Bob Marley popularized it in a song. In the abundance of water, only the fool is thirsty. In the abundance of water, only the fool is thirsty. Like Derico Cooper says, we build whole communities right out of slavery: home, school, church, police, fire, politics, etc. And he gave an example, Princeville, North Carolina. Right, there's examples all over, wherever there's black folks who were persecuted in the Ma'afa, right after we've done things. There's examples everywhere. Mr. Untouchable brought up Jesus, and I saw the pro-black perspective and what's that sister name, Goddess such and such, on Twitter. I saw, for some reason, they were talking about Abrahamic religions today. And listen, I get 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago, we were caught up in that stuff. In fact, let me not say I get it. I see that we were caught up in that stuff. But in the abundance of water, the fool goes thirsty. Like, there's enough information out here to challenge yourself. And by the way, if we today are still, quote unquote, suffering under Christianity, white Jesus, and all that, you know what that means? That means our grandparents failed. If our grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the future are still suffering with under the tyranny of white Jesus and all this old shit, that means we failed. That's what accountability looks like. We have to do better. And we can't afford to sit up here for another 100 years, 200 years, whatever length of time. We cannot afford to sit up here and have the same shit going on, keeping us locked down within our own communities. We already know we have enemies outside of us. The stuff that's keeping us down inside, we need to shut that down. As a matter of fact, I remember V-Web from the Harsh Reality podcast talking about this on Twitter one time. It was an interesting conversation. I wish I could recall the whole thing, but one of the things him and this other youth man was saying, which is true, is that for most black folks, if we're keeping it real, their biggest problem or the biggest enemy that they face daily is not a white person. It's another black person. I understand the systems of oppression. I understand how systematic racism is. I get all that. But there's some rules to some shit sometimes. There's some accountability you have to get. You feel me? Mr. Untouchable, Achieve Mindset says hello. Hello to Achieve. He says true as well. Mr. Untouchable says there is a need for schools and colleges that teaches how to solve black community problems, not white community issues. This is why we are like a fish out of water when we graduate university. Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. We have to be about our own education. I think I heard the pro-black perspective echo this thought the other day, but I also remember it from the book, The Education of the Negro. Everyone talks about the miseducation of the Negro from College Woods. But The Education of the Negro is an interesting book. It's a very interesting read, too. As a matter of fact, Dr. John Henry Clark does the forward for that book. So you already know, right? One of the things that Dr. John Henry Clark says in the forward of the book, like the first page of the book, which always stuck with me, is unfortunately African people in the United States still have some prevailing misconceptions about their education and education in general. We were not brought to the United States or the so-called New World to be educated. We were brought as part of a massive labor supply. Some slave owners saw fit to train their slaves in the repair of farm equipment and certain aspects of the blacksmith trade. What the slave masters permitted was training, not education. We got to get off of that training thing and we got to start getting educated. Right? We have to get off that training thing and we got to start getting educated. Right? Rico Cooper Photography says, in an abundance of water, the fool goes thirsty. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, come on. If I know about the bullshit of the Abrahamic religions, shouldn't my children know about the bullshit of the Abrahamic religions? If you had guys like, because Mr. Untouchable mentioned, ask people who Garvey is. Okay, I get it. Garvey was a long time ago, right? But we've had, the thing about Garvey is that, and this is the thing people overlook, There's a lineage from God. There's a lineage from God. Okay, so you didn't know Carlos Cooks, but you know Malcolm X. And others who were inspired, say, from a Garvey, you know, Kwame Nkrumah, you know, etc. We cannot continue to carry this thinking, this thought process that, well, we just didn't know. End of story, full stop. That's unacceptable. Our story needs to be, well, we didn't know it then, but we damn sure know it now. And we for damn sure will know it in the future, because we will do the work to carry on the information, to carry on the knowledge. Dr. Amos Wilson, right? Chief Mindset asked me, what's the name of the book? Which book? You're talking about the book that Dr. John Henry Clark did the forward for. That's a Carter G. Woodson book called The Education of the Negro. Most people are familiar with the Miseducation of the Negro, but there's also The Education of the Negro. If you're talking about this paper, the title literally is, Some Theories Regarding the Education of Black People. Right? Achieve Mindset says Garvey was not inspired. Achieve Mindset says that Nkrumah was not inspired by Garvey, and that's not true. He might have been also inspired by Padmo. He was also inspired by God. That's like a fact, right? Now, he did some bullshit that will make you question if he even knew who Garvey was, but he in fact was inspired by God, right? At the University of Pennsylvania, that's when he became aware of Garvey's movement and writings. You can look that up, all right? To continue with the reading. Before I go there, I see Mr. Untouchable states something that most people don't know. I've talked about it on the show before. Dr. Robert Love was a Bahamian, a man integral in Garvey's training. So there is an absolute lineage. Absolutely. Listen, if you like the pro-black perspective, guess what? That's a part of the Garvey lineage. And so to say that there's no, you didn't have the opportunity to drink water when you were surrounded by water is nonsense. I see a new face here today, Del J. Greetings, Del J. Del J says Garvey had worldwide influence. Ridiculous to say he did not, at a minimum, influence. Come on, man, he influenced Nkrumah. And so to go back to what my homeboy, Mr. Untouchable said earlier, you might not know Garvey yourself, but you definitely know Garvey's lineage. And these talking points and these ideas of not just Pan-Africanism, but black nationalism, black empowerment, black power, these thoughts have been out there. You know, shout out to Dr. Robert Love too. Mr. Untouchable, Dr. Robert Love was in Grantstown, right? It was Grantstown he lived at, I believe. You let me know in the chat. I'll read it in a second. Right? To continue. But it also should be noted that few of these intellectual vagabonds are genuinely educated persons. Many of them have barely passed through school. Persons who were exposed to the contagion of education who had only a mild attack of the disease. Consequently, in all of the large urban centers of America today, there are hundreds of idle, carefree, irresponsible, and worthless college-bred Negroes. So let me say this about this talking point right here. I came to the States in the mid-90s, smack dab mid-90s. And I went to college. I did undergrad here. And something I noticed, not only having been in college, but also working on a college campus to this day, there's a lot of black folks who go and get a college education. And because you got to go beg these other people for a job, a lot of them are idle. A lot of them are idle, not doing nothing. This was true in the late 90s, early 2000s. A lot of black folks were idle doing that. And what I noticed happened often, and if you guys are college educated, right? If you guys are college educated, you guys let me know if this sounds familiar to you. When it came to black folks in particular, being restless and unemployed after getting an education, what I noticed became a commonplace thing for a lot of black folks. A black guy will go to college for biology like I did, right? And when that ain't panning out for them, they'll be back in college again, getting another degree in psychology. Or if they heard word on the street was, well, computer programming is the new area, they'll be back in school fighting up, trying to get, back in college, fighting up, trying to get a degree again in computer science. Racking up more debt, losing more time, right? And by the way, if you have any college-age children around you, let me tell you something. When it comes to that computer science world, the way to go is to get certifications, right? Yeah, Mr. Untouchable gave them the right title. That's the title that we professional students. When I was a young guy in undergrad, I knew big men, grown men my age now, but back then, who were still floundering around in school. As a matter of fact, I knew a Guyanese brethren. He was working, when I was in undergrad, he was working on his 4th master's or something like that in mathematics. The learning curve with the revolutionary matron just said it. The forever student. Right? Why do you think that's happening? That's happening because you go out here, you excel, you get this degree, and then you can't even go to your own people and put that knowledge to some use. You gotta go beg someone else to give you a job. Do you think when they see you come in there and you're well educated and a smart type person, to come and show up some of their people? Or to come feeling like you could demand good coin? You're crazy. And so this problem that this writer is talking about back in the 1940s is still going on 50, 60 years later when I was an undergrad. And it's still, and trust me, because I still work in academia, it's going on today. Mr. Untouchable knows what I'm talking about. He says facts. IT only needs certifications, CompTIA, and all that. Yeah, absolutely. A job might require you to have an undergrad degree. You go get a degree in English or history or some easy bullshit, and after that you work your ass off and get all the certifications you need. Rico Cooper earlier said the pro-black perspective is part of the Garvey. Oh, he's quoting me. Facts. Right? He goes on to say Garvey was attempting to set up a blue water navy. Right? Achieve Mindset says we need traders, not admins. Yeah. That's what you find. You find black folks out here, quote unquote, worthless. I mean, they're not worthless to us, of course, but they're not that. Their education isn't bringing in anything for them. And is it this paper, or is it another paper I was reading? I read so many of these papers, I get crossed up. But what you will also see, and I can tell you this as a fact in sciences, a lot of the black folks you see getting degrees in science, especially, but not limited to, they're going to become teachers. They're not going to be, leaders of industry and all that stuff. They're thinking that way. They're thinking that's their future, but they're going to end up being teachers. I've seen it time and time again. A lot of the science teachers that you see in public school systems or what have you, they had something else in mind. They have something else in mind. So they've only been a part of the quote-unquote education system to go and be a part of the education system. Chief Mindset says, I think in an African education setting. I'm not sure what he is referring to. Young adults from 18 to 21 should be placed in jobs and in entry roles when they are about 22 years old and mature in the field. They can do to, I guess, go to university. It will remove the silly behaviors. Mr. Untouchable says, go get a real estate license for a couple $100. At least you're not in a mountain of debt and you can make a good living, right? Yeah, but that's what you see going on. There's a lot of black folks who are going into colleges thinking they're going to be, this big scientist, this big researcher, or they're going to be this medical doctor, and what ends up happening? They don't make it to, to those stations. Not that there's anything wrong with teaching, but they end up teaching usually in the public school system. To continue, much of this intellectual wastage, however, is traceable to the Negro's restricted economic outlet, for it must be remembered that there are very few jobs for the educated Negro. That's because we're begging other people for jobs. One finds, therefore, that the avenues of life which are open to educated Negroes are becoming increasingly overcrowded. And that's the other thing. What they don't teach you in these colleges is that there's only a certain number of seats at the table. This is how Europeans operate. There's a certain amount of seats at the table, and you're not really invited to that table. And if someone is, it'll be one of us. You hear comedians talk about, the black comedians talk about this all the time. Like, there's a bunch of us out here funny, but they only give one comedian shine at a time. This is how this system works. Anyway, consequently, the higher education of Negroes, instead of preparing them to assume positions and avenues of life other than the educational system itself, tends rather to force them back into that system. So it's this paper, right? These are the points that made me think, I'm going to read this paper. on this show because I've seen these things. A lot of our people are going into the education, the so-called higher education system, that number one is not really meant for you anyway. It's definitely not meant for you to empower your tribe, your village, your community, your people. Anyway. And so a lot of us end up going into this so-called higher education only to come through it and find out that what you thought you were going to do, you can't do. The system is set up in such a way, they gatekeep you out of what they're doing. And you know what? Rightfully so. They're holding positions for their people to flourish. I get it. And for as long as this has been going on, you mean to tell me we still making excuses for not knowing what's going on? Nah, man. Come off of that nonsense. Come off of that. Let me read that again. Consequently, the higher education of Negroes, instead of preparing them to assume positions in avenues of life other than the educational system itself, tends rather to force them back into that system. Higher education, insofar as it bears any direct relation to the field of Negro improvement, becomes virtually an end in itself. Very large percentage of the persons who are receiving higher education are preparing to teach school. Again, I ask you guys who are here live or if in the playback, has this been your observation? Has this been what you've seen yourself? The chief mindset says the land in Ghana and Accra around the airport is worth 1 million. Foreign have bought it all. But you have FBA and ADOS saying that they do not like us over there. Right? Chief mindset says one at a time, facts. One at a time, facts. And to be clear, I'm not dismissive of the perspective of what has happened. I'm not being dismissive of the perspectives on what has happened to Black, which equals African people. I'm Black myself, I'm African. I was born just after, my hometown gained quote unquote independence. I grew up under a British system of education. In fact, Mr. Untouchable would know what I'm talking about. I was in the first class of people that took the BGCSE exam. Right? So that if he knows anything about when that started, he can tell my age. I was in the first class of people who took that exam, and that exam was meant to be a Bahamian alternative to a British examination system. Because educators, and I've talked about this in the show too, educators at the time realized, for some time actually, that it makes no sense that we have Bahamian children sitting down here taking exams mailed to us from the UK based on UK scenarios and expecting us to write essays and all this shit on UK scenarios and UK wording of no. Educators decided, no, we gotta have our own African, by way of Bahamian, centered education and centered examination. Dorito Cooper Photography says that is exactly what I see. Thank you. Thank you. That's exactly what I see. I see most of those folks who I went to college with, especially in the sciences, who thought, each one had the thinking that most of them are educators now, and mostly in the public school system. Chief mindset says all other races are building their own for their own children, so we should do the same. Chief mindset says I will be back. All right. The Chief, Dorico says facts. Listen, I'll never put another group on the same level or platform with us as black folks, black equals African folks, in terms of the sufferation and what we've been put through. But other people went through, situations, other groups went through situations, and they didn't sit back and say, well, we were indoctrinated, so this is why we do. No, they sought to create their own nations immediately after. If they didn't have one before, they damn sure went on to start creating their own nation. They let what happened to them in the past push them to never let that shit happen again. To nation up and make sure that you can't just come and attack our people again. So much so that some of these folks can go anywhere in the world and they're quote unquote untouchable in the world. So I'm not dismissive. It's not that I mean, how can I be dismissive when my own people came through the shit? But we gotta stop with the excuses. If there's black children out here who don't know not to kill another black person, that's our failing. Don't tell me about white supremacy. That's our failing. To continue. Don't tell me about white indoctrination. We've known about the indoctrination. We've been known about it. It's time for us to start taking some accountability and doing better. To continue, the result of this is that the public school systems throughout the country are coming more and more under the influence and domination of Negro teachers who both by aptitude and training are virtually misfits. Ultimately, this will mean gross inefficiency and mediocrity in the public school system, for the primal interest of many of these teachers is merely the winning of a fairly satisfactory livelihood. It now appears, however, that even this means of livelihood for educated Negroes is becoming less and less available. So that at the end of each school year, one may behold many long academic processions of educated Negroes bound for nowhere. This writer was writing this in 1940. A long procession of educated Negroes headed for not a damn place, nowhere. You're telling me we're not seeing this? You're telling me we're not seeing it? To continue. The question of separate institutions for the white and Negro races in America is another point about which a great deal of acrimonious controversy has raged. This controversy has given rise to separate factions within both races and to two separate theories. For the attitudes of both white peoples and Negroes have been expressed both for and against separate institutions. There are both Negroes and white people who feel that it is to the best interest of the Negro that he share all social institutions in contact with the whites, and that institutions which are maintained for the general public welfare should not be separated along the lines of racial distinction. That for such institutions are undemocratic and unchristian. That the distribution of public funds for their maintenance is unjust to the Negro, that Negroes who are trained in these separate institutions are not allowed access to the same facilities and advantages as are the white persons. That such separation tends to accentuate race prejudice. That biracialism is a repudiation of the fundamental principles of American idealism and as a definite slap at Christianity. Listen, like Dr. John Henry Clark said, they didn't bring your ass here for education. Remember when this paper was written? You weren't here for no damn education, so the education isn't designed for you. The education really is just designed for you to give them more labor, which is a dead-end situation for black people. It's a dead-end situation. Listen, we could have feigned ignorance when the Portuguese and them came to the continent. We didn't know no better. We had no idea people were so wicked out there that they would do this inhumane, barbaric, chattel slavery. But guess what? We went through it. It happened. Unfortunately, we went through it. We ain't supposed to be feigning no ignorance again as to what these people can do, what their innate intentions are. Ultimately, this will mean gross inefficiency. I'm sorry, I read that again already. There is another faction within both the Negro and white groups, a faction which has long embraced the majority of white people and is now becoming noticeably large and significant among Negroes. That contends that the separate institution is the most effective channel through which the Negro can attain full self-realization. That the separate institution enables him to develop his talents free from the ever-menacing handicap of white prejudice. That's it. Yemi Yemi says hello to the room. Room, you all say hello to Yemi Yemi. Yemi Yemi, good to see you. Again, it's been a while. I think I said every time you come through. Make sure you guys hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, I think everyone who's here must have subscribed. If you haven't subscribed, make sure to subscribe. Click the bell to be notified when I'm on live or when I upload new content. Speaking of that, by the way, I have this teaching assignment this semester on Tuesdays, so the show probably won't be live on Tuesdays for a little bit, but there will be a Tuesday show still. I'll probably record it on Monday, live premiere it on Tuesday. You guys can still come through in the chat and you know, post your opinions, your thoughts, etc. Right? There'll still be a show on Tuesday nights. It won't be a live stream show. Right? Still come through, post your thoughts, etc. Right? To continue, that it provides the proper stimulus to race pride and self-esteem for the inspiration of Negro leaders. That the separate institution trains Negro youth who exhibit more initiative, self-confidence, and capacity for leadership than do those who develop in institutions designed primarily for white people. For the limitations resulting from their color preclude their complete participation in the life of white institutions. This faction also contends that the limitation of contact reduces the amount of friction between the two races, and that this serves to protect the interests and preserve the ultimate good of both races. Before I go to do the station ID break, I just want to share with you all too. Back when I was getting ready to come out here to go to college, mid-90s, smack dab in the middle of the night, I remember a popular conversation that used to go on. And it just shows that it's not just Africans in America who were indoctrinated. Africans everywhere were indoctrinated. There used to be this conversation that used to go on of like, don't go to a HBCU, right? Because the reality is you're going to go and just hang around black folks, and the world is not just black folks. So the idea people used to push literally was, take yourself to one of these PWI schools so that you can intentionally be around white folks, because that shows you how deep our indoctrination is. But even then, I was looking at people like, what? It would make more sense to go to an all-black school. I wish I could have, or I should say, I wish I did. But that's the kind of rhetoric that was going on back in the day. And if I had to guess, some of it is probably still going on today. Right? Let me take a station ID break here. I'll be back on the other side. Right? How many of you, when you were college age, thinking to go off to college, how many of you heard that argument before? Yemi said, I have heard that argument before. How many of the rest of you here with me live have heard that argument before? I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure to check out all those shows on KWAZ Radio. Make sure to check out all of those shows on KWAZ Radio. In the chat room, Yemi says that he went to an HBCU. I hope I remember correctly that Yemi is a guy, but they went to an HBCU, and they've heard that argument that I talked about just before the commercial break. Chief Mindset says college is the best time to train young minds to solve our problems, and that's the thing, Chief Mindset. Which college? If they ain't our colleges, then we ain't training shit. Much less training folks to solve our problem. And this is why we can't sit. Oh, Yemi is a female. Yemi, please accept my apologies. Please accept my apologies, Yemi. Right? Right? This is why we can't sit down talking about being ignorant anymore. We can't sit down talking about, well, we don't know, we didn't know, and nah. It's too late for that now. It's too late for that. It's the same thing with our folks following grifters. It's too late for that now. It's too late for that now. We had a bunch of people before who were grifters. Don't tell me you don't know about grifters. It's too late for that. Yemi, she says, I told my parents I want to go to an HBCU. Right? Were they the ones who told you that the HBCU is not? And again, HBCUs, a lot of times they're funded by, our enemies, to be real. The curriculum is designed oftentimes or has to follow what our enemies say it has to follow. This is why we gotta start doing our own thing. This is why we gotta start doing our own thing. But the most important thing we gotta start doing is we gotta start educating our people from young. We can't wait around for someone or some imaginary thing to come along and fix the problem that we're in. Well, KW7 says there's no black colleges in Canada. He thinks there's one black high school in Toronto. Wow. It's crazy. Right? We have to stand up, be accountable, like the same way. And what's so crazy is, like, if I came out here and I saw a black woman getting beat up by a white boy or something, and I didn't do anything, everyone will say, why didn't you do something? What if I said, well, I didn't know I was supposed to do something? Everyone will take me to task for claiming some dumb shit like that. Right? The Rico Cooper photography asks, who is Spellman named after? Isn't that the name of some president's wife or something like that? Right? Some white boy's wife? Right? Which is the point Dorico's trying to make. Right? But if I went outside, no, seriously, if I went outside and I stood there while some white boy violated a black woman, everyone will say to me, well, why didn't you get involved? I can't say to you guys, well, I didn't know I didn't know I was supposed to care about black people. Everyone will suck their teeth at the same time. Let's stop that now. Let's stand up. You want black men to be protectors and providers, but they can't feign ignorance and say, well, I didn't know. Come on. The positions taken by the first faction are certainly in keeping with Christianity, the concept of democracy, and are certainly expressions of the very highest idealism. These contentions express certain utopian ideals in race relations. Ideals, however, which are perhaps beyond the present moral competence of the human race. They are beautiful ideals, but they are scarcely practical and efficacious. For in their naivety, the protagonists of these ideals assume that human nature is fundamentally weak and corrupt, and that what it needs most of all is moral and intellectual guidance. The weakness, however, of all these contentions lies in the fact that they overlook and ignore the fundamental characteristics of human conduct. They overlook the social attitudes which lie at the very basis of all social organization and social development. Whether we like it or not, social relations are determined to a great extent by forces over which we have little or no control. The responses and attitudes of man are caused not so much by rational processes as they are by conditions imposed by nature and human nature. Man has not thought himself into his present set of opinions and attitudes. They have been ingrained into him by the experience of the race. And I agree with this. But if something you believe, there's all, not to be a biblical person, but what's the saying again? If your right hand deceives you, you do what? You chop the fucker off. We love our right hand. We need our right hand. If it deceives you, though, get rid of it. If you follow the indoctrination, you realize, wait a minute, this shit ain't making no sense. Get rid of it. Yummy Yummy says, my parents were okay with me going to an HBCU. When they had conversations with other black parents, they were the ones saying that black students should go to white schools because once we go into the ... I'm sure she's going to say the real world, you're going to be around white folks and all this old shit. Okay? The advocates of these utopian positions have been guilty of two major errors. First, they have placed undue faith in mere affirmations and pronouncements which are little more than empty watchwords which are powerless to bring into being the kind of social conditions hoped for. The second, they have completely ignored much of the fundamental nature of human behavior. So let me see what they say here, but let me tell you something about human behavior. Human behavior can be changed. It depends on what you give for the change to occur. For the right price, you can get a straight guy to become a famous gay rapper for the right price. Human behavior is something that has always been something malleable. So let's not pretend like human behavior is what it is. And so it is what it is. Yemi says workforce will be working with mostly white, so we need to get accustomed to navigating an environment that is predominantly white. But that's the problem. You see, we have these tertiary levels of education, and we're not creating a lane, an avenue for this procession of recently educated black folks to go into. To continue, the degree of contact which should exist between two diverse groups of people cannot be determined in any theoretical and rational way, but must be determined by the nature of the actual conditions which this contact creates. Race contact should exist only to the extent that it promotes wholesome relations. Contact that tends to produce more or less permanent interracial irritation and antagonism should certainly be regarded as unwholesome. Moreover, contacts that tend to destroy self-respect, self-confidence, and block the way to self-expression should be discouraged. How clear is that? It is well to note that owing to the manner in which the life of the two races is interwoven, there could not and should not be complete separation between the two. For a long time to come, the Negro will need the stimulus and inspiration of the white man's civilization. Now here's where the bullshit comes. For a long time to come, Negro will need the stimulus and inspiration of the white man's civilization. Let me ask you guys a silly question. How many of you need the white man's inspiration? How many of you need the white man's stimulus today? Among many things, he will need to catch the white man's spirit of thrift and thoroughness and his genius for organization. But it is equally obvious, in view of the natural forces and laws which govern the relations of races living together, that the successful development of the Negro race in America must be carried on both in contact with and in isolation from the white race. To imitate contact would prove just as inimical to its progress and development as would too much isolation, for the Negro appears to have made its greatest strides of advancement in those areas of his life where there has been a rather free flow of stimulation from the culture of the whites, yet where he could successfully maintain a separate existence. So this is the bullshit part. Obviously, too, in the Negro, which are advantageous to his survival. It destroys his group morale and causes him to lose sight of group objectives, right? Yeah, you know, this kind of stuff is what irritates me with certain writers, that makes you question where their allegiances really are. Why would I care, right? If I understand that being around this white is gonna dull my sharpness, my Africanness, why do I need to be around him, period? If I know there's a risk of losing group morale and sight of the group objectives, then I don't need to be around him. I just need to be aware of him. I ain't gotta be around him. I gotta be aware of him. The Learning Curve with the Revolutionary Matron. You guys make sure to check out The Learning Curve, the new show on KWAZ Radio. All right, check out The Learning Curve with the Revolutionary Matron. She says, none of us need their inspiration. I know I for damn sure don't. The matron doesn't need it. None of us on KWAZ radio, none of you guys listening need their inspiration. Right? These white boys could give that shit up. But the most significant fact about society is its organization into group life. It is to be expected, therefore, that the two races in their contact will be obliged to maintain at least a degree of isolation. By the way, to go back to a point, and again, this is why I have a problem with these writers. This writer is saying how we're going to gain all this shit from being around white folks. He says nothing about what white folks will gain for being around us. Nowhere does this question of the degree of contact and isolation between the two races project itself more forcibly upon our attention than it does in the field of education. This is all the more so because of the nature and significance of the educational process. So public education is one of the most vital and important functions of human society. Hence, any handicaps and frustrations in this avenue of life prove serious impediments in the development of individual and group personality. It is of paramount importance, therefore, that the conditions under which the young are trained should be the best possible. You hear that, black folks? To put in black and white, the statement which is to follow is to invite widespread criticism. But in science, one must speak the truth as he sees it, even though it may provoke controversy, necessitate rejoinder. It appears, considering both the process and the results, that the education of Negroes is superior and more successful in the separate school system than it is in the mixed schools. Paper written in 1940, people. It should not and would not be if race prejudice were not existent. But the superiority of the separate Negro school over that type of educational institution, which provides for the education of both races, can be accounted for in terms of the fact that it permits the Negro unlimited participation in all phases of school life. It furnishes the proper stimulus to self and race pride, keeps the Negro before the student, the ideals and aspirations of the Negro group. For teachers are not merely instructors, but also inspirers of group loyalty and creators of ideals. Right? And by the way, he would be talking about Booker T's institutions, Tuskegee Institute, for example, and other schools like it around the time of this writing. Right? Rigo Cooper Photography says, shit, in his Clay Davis voice. Right? He says the revolutionary matron facts. KW Don 7 says, outside of barbershops and West Indian corner shops and restaurants, there isn't much black business or push towards self-determination in Canada. That's a problem, KW Don 7. And I'm sure you're saying that because you recognize the problem. As I continue this reading, I want to ask you guys in the chat room, just to give me an idea, what do you think? Or you know what? Let me ask this question. How do you feel when black folks tell you that personal accountability means nothing? That the indoctrination is the end all and be all to the black condition, to the African condition, and it's not. And personal accountability is lack of conscience. Ignorance is not a solution because the indoctrination is more powerful. What do you say to that? I'd like to hear from Derico Cooper, KW Don 7, the Revolutionary Matron. Like, I'd like to hear, what is your what is your response to that? That you know, let's put it in terms of a scale. That the indoctrination is too heavy. That no black, you know, consciousness, no black accountability, self-accountability for ourselves and our communities can mean anything. That a lot of our people just didn't know, just don't know, just didn't know, and then, you know, and that's it. White indoctrination is too strong, force is too strong with them, and black folks didn't know no better, so they didn't do it. Derico Cooper says, open hand slap. I'd like to hear from the matron on this. And by the way, if you want to voice your thoughts on air, you can always jump into the Discord, go to the on air, the voice channel, and voice your opinions. All right? Open hand slap is a good response. What says the rest of it? All right? Because of the limited number of avenues of employment for Negroes, Negro School is able to attract some of the best minds within the Negro race as its teachers. The Negro School has equaled the mixed school in its production of efficient and powerful public Negro leaders. Above all else, the Negro School understands the Negro. It understands his limitations and his possibilities, his spirit, and his genius. That sounds almost like something Dr. Amos Wilson would have said. The value of the separate school system for Negroes is most clearly demonstrated in such large cities as Washington, D.C., St. Louis, Missouri, and St. Louis, Missouri. Both of these systems, because of the manner in which they have vitalized and elevated the intellectual tone of their respective communities, stand out as splendid examples of the possibilities of separate education. The separate school system, however, reaches a point of diminishing value the further we go beyond the secondary schools until beyond the college and the graduate school, its value virtually disappears. But educators should never lose sight of the fact that for the enlightenment of the great masses of Negroes. So, you know, let me touch on that for a second. Let me touch on that first. Ideally, you want to have your school system, African-centered education, tied to African-centered industries. And you want to be able to create a pipeline that takes the African-centered educated students, that procession they talked about earlier. You want a pipeline where you send that procession right down into the African-centered industries. Industries that will help build power on the continent and within the diaspora. Right? When you go beyond secondary school into the tertiary school area, and again, we don't talk about this enough, and in a way, I understand why we don't talk about it enough, because we haven't tackled the first part of the problem. We need primary and secondary African-centered education first. And then we need a tertiary education that's also African-centered, right? Now, if you receive an African-centered education, and then you went to these PWIs, right, for your tertiary education, and then from there, you're going to take that degree just to go beg white folks for a job again, of course it has diminishing returns. Of course it does. Now, if you're able in your primary and secondary education to solidify the mindset of the students to be African-centered. And for whatever reasons, they have to find themselves out here getting jobs from these other folks. But they still have an African centers to them, so they're still contributing to the African community. They're still contributing their intellect, their labor towards building African nations. Then that's fine. That's fine. Right? Before I continue, the chat room, the learning curve, revolutionary matron says, I think that the consciousness has been co-opted by white consciousness because no one keeps telling their stories. They only seek to make each other comfortable in the prison. She goes on to say, no one wants to take responsibility for anything. The people that stay on trend, penalizing each other for following the trend of mutual destruction of each other. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Don't tell me that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so forth and so on are going to suffer because of the ignorance of black folks and the indoctrination that they endure. Are you serious? So we're sitting up here making more and more Africans to suffer because of what happened in the past and the indoctrination that might linger? Nah. Well, if that's the case, it's best I go walk off a bridge tonight and take my peoples with me. It's best I go walk off a bridge tonight. I told this story before too. Tupac Shakur, who I always, frankly, I call him an idiot anyway. Tupac Shakur, before he died, he was in, I want to say it was Milwaukee, doing a show, and he went off on a rant. I think it's on YouTube too. He went into this rant against the street dudes who was at his show. You know, these Chicago dudes. And he went off on this rant because these Chicago dudes had I want to say the kid was 10. I used to remember the kid's name. Now I'm on here and I'm forgetting the kid's name now. This young kid shot and killed like another 8-year-old kid or something like that. And because it was so egregious what this kid did, that the cops and stuff was looking for him. And his own gang was afraid that if the cops get their hand on this 10-year-old kid, put him in the station with handcuffs and beating the shit out of him, of course, he's going to name names of other dudes and get other dudes hemmed up in the system. Why am I drawing a blank on this kid's name? And this kid then, two other young kids, two other teenagers, like 14, 15, had to lure this kid down a path and kill him. So this 10-year-old kid kills like an 8-year-old kid with a gun, right? And Tupac is like, how did y'all let some dumb shit like that happen? How did y'all let a 10-year-old kid be walking around out here with a gun and able to kill a 8-year-old kid? And then how did y'all go and get these young teenagers, 14, 15-year-old kids, to have to kill that kid? And as silly as I consider Tupac to be, he was right in what he was saying. And then, of course, they got upset and they started throwing stuff on the stage. You can look that up. Right? But even Tupac was trying to tell these folks, be accountable. Right? I can see the number of viewers have dipped. It's all good. I'm gonna say what I gotta say. Right? KW7 says accountability has to start at home. Too many of us stumble into consciousness later in life. Too much of us are stumbling to this shit later in life. Draco Cool Photography says that's like Django wanted to be Steven. Revolution Matron says to KW7, accountability starts at home. The BS only gets in because we let it. This is why I talked about some weeks ago, police your communities. I don't want to hear that bullshit. This dude had to sell drugs in front of my kids. Had to offer drugs to my kids because he had to sell some shit. Go sell that elsewhere. Police your communities. Set up standards in your youth so that they could grow up to be something, you know, adults with standards. The matron says we refuse to acknowledge that there are several community members that are tools of white consciousness. Absolutely. Rico quotes, in order for us to be in the situation we are in, we have to be crazy, literally crazy. We have to start with that. Dr. Amos Wilson, absolutely. But educators should never lose sight of the fact that for the enlightenment of the great masses of Negroes under our present circumstances, the Negro school, manned and controlled by able Negro leaders, is the most powerful and constructive agency in the life of the American Negro. Would that it were otherwise, that it were possible for Negroes and whites to be educated en masse in the same schools, but prejudice, an ugly thing which appears to have existed from time immemorial, and which gives evidence of remaining here in some form unto time eternal, makes necessary our present acceptance of this alternative. Right? And that's the end of the paper. And that's kind of the point I want to end with. White indoctrination, white prejudice, white nationalism, white supremacy, that ain't going nowhere. This will be eternal. So you telling me black folks are going to be in our situation for eternal too? Because we can't break away from the shackles of the indoctrination job that they done on us? You know, sometimes I believe black folks want to remain where they are. Because if someone is coming along and telling you, yo, the solution is to get off that shit. The solution is more black accountability in our communities. And your retort is, well, it's you know, God damn it, these white folks are too smart. The indoctrination is too heavy. It sounds like you want to stay where you are. I understand there's nuance to the problem. But first we have to address how to deal with the problem. And how to deal with it is we got to start being more accountable in our communities. And from there we'll work out the nuance. I understand we're indoctrinated. I understand it, because Malcolm X talked about it 60 goddamn years ago. I understand we were somehow taught to hate ourselves. But we gonna still be talking that shit 100 years from now? Well, then it's cheaper we didn't live. It's cheaper we didn't live. The matron says, consciousness is not taught in the home. The black woman consciousness was not taught in my home. Assimilation was the order of the day. So then let's teach consciousness in the home. To me, it's not complicated. Let's start educating these kids early and teach them what the pitfalls are. Because like the matron said earlier, we got folks working towards white consciousness. I told y'all guys before, I seen a grown man, this is many years ago, I saw a grown man rowing out a young boy talking about, are you afraid of jail? Are you a punk? We got to get them kind of folks up out the paint. And we got to get in that young boy's life and be like, yeah, don't listen to that asshole who was talking that dumb shit too. Yemi says, I was born into a conscious household. But when I run into people my age, they are not aware of what's going on. Rico Cool Photography says, I'm not black, I'm OJ. Okay. Yemi says, since I was black first, most I could not identify with. Since I was black first, I could not identify with most black people. Since I was black first, most I could not. Since I was black first, most I could not identify with most black people. Right. So, I hope you guys got something out of that paper. Let me know if you did. All right, if you're live with me or if you're in the playback, let me know if you got something out of this paper. It kind of rethreads other things that we've said, but it kind of was poignant today because of the conversation I had earlier. Which I get the take of the individual who was talking to me earlier. I do. But we're behind the 8 ball now. We ain't got time to coddle ourselves. Talk about what we didn't know. It's time for us to know. If you want to know more, listen to the other shows on KWAZ Radio. You'll always get some knowledge of what's currently going on. The challenge I give to you guys listening to me is, let's not exclude others because they're not conscious. This is a part of the problem. Let's start to include others. Let's start to get others involved earlier. Let's not have our people go to jail and then have to find Islam or something before they can be conscious. Let's not do that. Let's not sit down and watch. Let's not sit down and watch fellas in our community killing other black folks in our community, and we out here talking about, well, I ain't gonna be no snitch now. Are you involved in the murders with the person? No? Well, then let the authorities know to get this jackass up out of the community. A guy selling drugs in schools, around our children, get him up out the paint. Don't sit there and turn a blind eye. He gotta sell now. Get him up out the paint. We ain't got time to shield bad apples with good apples. Enough of that already. In the chat room, I see that Dorico says assimilation was the order of the day. Time for a new day. It's time for a new day. It is amazing how much time has passed and things are still the same. Yeah, it's still the same because we don't want to take personal responsibility. That's on us. Yemi says her parents gave her lots of books to read about our history in the USA, Caribbean, South America, and Africa. Be like Yemi's parents. She says, I never had to depend on the school to teach me about our history. Bravo. Shout out to Yemi Yemi's parents. Bravo. Like Dorico Cooper probably said, that's awesome, Yemi Yemi. That's awesome. We all supposed to be that way. In the abundance of water, in the abundance of water, the African should not be thirsty. You heard that here for the first. In the abundance of water, an African ain't supposed to be thirsty. Yemi Yemi says, when I say I could not relate, I don't mean that I was trying to separate myself from other blacks. I'm glad that you said this. However, they could not relate to me, so I was like I was an outsider in my own community. Yes. It's not about making conscious people better than anyone. It's not about being better. It's about what's better for the people. Stop bull jiving now and let's get serious. I told you all before, I told you before, and someone corroborated this with me the other day. Them white folks, they push those folks doing bullshit, selling meth and all that stuff, they push them to the other side of town. You can't be around white folks around there, affluent communities and schools doing that stuff. Now, it's not to say that some of that stuff doesn't enter into those schools, but you ain't gonna be just sitting up around peddling some shit right in the neighborhood. No, no, that doesn't happen. Police your communities. Be better. Right? The matron says we need a firm, strong chaos management team. Rico Cooper says facts. You know? I want to thank all you guys who are here with me tonight. I appreciate those of you who may have even left. Hopefully you guys will come back and listen to the playback. Thanks for all the likes, the listens. Thank you for any subs, and definitely thank you for the chat. Chat makes the podcast much more interactive. It brings something else to the chat. We gotta start discussing ideas more, not just amongst people who are already conscious people. We gotta start initiating conversations with the seemingly unconscious. Oh, Mr. Untouchable is still here. He says, great show. I appreciate it, Mr. Untouchable. All right. Yemi Yemi says, even now when I tell my coworkers that they should have a black doctor, they look at me puzzled and they say, why should I go to a black doctor? You know, I have a tooth that's been giving me a problem for a while. I have a black dentist, right? A lady from the Caribbean. I couldn't get a hold of them for the longest while. They finally reached out to me recently. I'll see them on Saturday. This coming Saturday morning. All right? Why would I go? You know, it's possible I might even have to get a tooth pulled. Why would I go to a white dentist for him to get his jollies and bringing me pain and pulling my teeth? I don't know if I was told this on the show. I had a surgical procedure done one time where I couldn't avoid but go around these white folks. And one of the attendants that they sent to me to give me a IV for anesthesia was a white broad. And when I tell you, the worst experience I've ever had with an IV being inserted was with this. It was so bad I had to look at this. I was gonna use a different term. I had to look at this asshole and say, hey, that is the worst insertion of a catheter I've ever experienced. What are you doing? What are you doing? Because I already know they think that a big guy like me, I don't feel no pain. I'm black, I don't feel no pain. I don't go around, I try to stay away from these folks as much as possible, especially when it comes to something interpersonal. So Yemi, you're right. Tell your coworker, you're black, you're supposed to be going to a black doctor. Right? Anyway, thanks again for coming through. Let me shout out everyone who was here. Mr. Untouchable, 242. Shout out to you. He says the white dentist instruments are sharper. You know how we go. Yeah. Right? TMI on the catheter. No, the catheter was in my arm. It wasn't. Can you imagine going around these folks and had to put a catheter in your bamboo pots? Come on, you crazy? Yeah, but it was a catheter in my arm, and I had to tell her, like, yo, what the fuck are you doing? I literally had to curse her, like, what the fuck are you doing? Right? Shout out to the Pro Black Perspective for being here. Shout out to Derico Cooper Photography. Shout out to Mr. Untouchable. Shout out to the Revolutionary Matron. Matron, are you on tonight again, or is that tomorrow? Shout out to Yemi. Yemi was very talkative tonight. I appreciate that, Yemi. Yemi, if you haven't already, I think you might have already. If you haven't already, join the Discord. We can have more conversations on the Discord. KW Don 7 was here as well. Tatum's was here and then disappeared. Chief Mindset said he was coming back. Still ain't reached back yet. But thanks for being here. You know, if I missed anyone, I apologize. But I think I got everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'll be back on Thursday. Right? I'll be back on Thursday with another take associated with our miseducation and educational requirements we need to consider. I'll see you guys then. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.